Evening, how are we doing? Are we set to go? Good. Wonderful pleasure to welcome back to the Architectural Association Charles Jencks, who joins us, having been away from this lectern for only about a year, I would reckon. In fact, someone who knows this room incredibly well, and in fact the room, I think, knows Charles well also. Indeed, he knows this very piece of furniture that will be standing in front of this evening, which I reckon he stood in front of about 40 years ago in presenting material related to this book, an expanded and updated edition of a book titled Adhocism, which will be the subject of tonight's talk, which Charles wrote with Nathan Silver, who is also here this evening, the two who have worked on a new edition and added material to an argument originally written in the 1970s, published in 1972, and one of at least three, and likely many more, very important texts which Charles authored and in fact largely wrote and published here in London in the 1970s, books that include in 1969, 3 years before that, I believe it was published Meaning in Architecture, an incredibly important and in fact seminal book on contemporary architectural, not just histories, but also theories that he undertook with a group of co-authors, and of course books on postmodernism and other closely related topics to tonight's presentation. Adhocism has as a subtitle, The Case for Improvisation, and indeed it is that. It is a sustained argument for the improvised and an often suppressed legacy of improvisation within modern art and architectural practice and discourses. The 1970s was indeed a period of the uncovering of, you could say, the counter-histories to architecture in the monolithic form that modernism presented itself for the decades leading up to Charles' sustained project in bringing postmodernism forward, and in fact returning the history to the project of modern architecture as we know it. I think everybody in this room will be very familiar with his many titles. He has been for decades a teacher, an author, an editor, an architect, a landscape architect, and a client of immense importance within architectural life. He has, of course, as well, and for as many decades, been a well-known raconteur, rascal, provocateur, moderator, mediator, and in very great ways, aviator, flying around the world and connecting the dots that many of us couldn't possibly figure out how to map. And tonight's project will be a latest demonstration of that. His life doesn't just document, it indeed embodies the many, many contradictions that many people are afraid of in architecture that, of course, he embraces with great enthusiasm. Please join me in welcoming back to the A. Charles Jencks. Let me just say, we have copies of the text in the back room there in the South Jury Room. Charles and Nathan have both agreed to sign copies at the end of this, so please hang around for that. And Charles, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here listening to that long, only Americans can introduce another American like that in an improvisational way. Thank you. Making it up as you go along. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm say a couple of things. First of all, one of the proudest times of my life was when this book won an award in 1972 from the Mark Twain Society as the funniest book of the year. You can only really write a funny book if you're absolutely and utterly serious and humorless, as Nathan and I are completely, as we wrote this book without a smile on our face, taking yourself so seriously. And if you look closely at the book, in my case at least, the introduction to each chapter is a kind of willful parody of Le Corbusier as a polemic of errors in architecture. You can't get more serious than that, can you, Nathan? Anyway, no. Anyway, so I'm glad for the recognition from the Mark Twain Society. I'm talking about, this book had a trouble with its title because people think they know what it is, and so it's sold under alcoholism for a while. They misread it. Anyway, we all think we know what it is, and we do know what it is because it's so much in our lives. You can't almost say anything new about it, and would you want to anyway? No. So, but there is an aspect, and I want to think with you about this strange concept, because it's a philosophical concept as well as a practice and lifestyle, an art movement, architectural movement, time city, a whole series of things I'll be quickly racing through. But there are moments of dead seriousness in it about creativity. And my argument is, and you'll see this, the style of eureka. Eureka, I found it. It's the style of eureka of creation at its basic moment, before the stylists get in, before Norman Foster gets in, before the Branders get in, before everybody papers over the cracks, before you think twice. It's the first thought. So it's raw in the beginning, you know, it's before thought in a way. Putting together. And of course, we all do this all the time and have an incredible amount of small-minded pride in when we do it. We congratulate ourselves, don't we, for anything, using a bottle lamp. Or look, this is ad hoc, when I'm ready-mades that are aided, as Duchamp would say. But I want to start with a good example of this, which is known in art history, but not in architectural history, really, by Abbot Suger, who created the Gothic style. Now, creativity, what is creativity? Arthur Koestler wrote The Art of Creation in 1964, and he argues, and I think this has never been refuted, and it remains true. It's not a completely original idea, but he's very scientific about it. He says creation is the bisociation of matrices, the bringing together of things which were previously divided at the eureka moment and fused together, either because of something in common, which is in humor, which he discusses, comedy and so on, tragedy is a different kind of binding together, or in science, biochemistry, or any field, two fields that are, you know, space-time, physics, and Einstein. Creativity is this bringing together of opposites, with the joint showing and the bisociation showing. Abbot Suger creates the Gothic, so this is very important architectural history, in 1150 at Saint-Denis outside Paris, where he takes, you know, a new light, a new space, a Romanesque space, a new stained glass, flying buttress, high space, continuous space, and he throws it together, and he does it out of a metaphysical attack on Saint Bernard, the white Cistercian minimalist architect of that time. And he and Saint Bernard hated each other. Saint Bernard said, you can't look at gargoyles, you can't look at things, you've got to be iconoclast, you can't think of anything except God. And Suger wrote back these polemics saying, no, if you use gold, silver, ornament, porphyry, red marble, it's to elevate the mind, it's to lift you up, it's the complexity of all that. And when he does his ad hoc invention, he's very proud. We have his testimony, and it's so exciting to get, you know, putting together. He said, I got this Roman, or is it Egyptian vase, red porphyry, I polished it up, it was sitting in the attic for 400 years, and, you know, the kings of France. We took it out, and it was for wine, but we put on it legs, these legs of an eagle, and incredible wings of an eagle, and look at that head, that fierce golden silver head, and put it together, bisociated it, and it's because, and here's the conceptual breakthrough in a way, it's because of the idea and the spirit behind it that it elevates it more than marble. Of course, he's attacked by St. Bernard as bling, you know, as kitsch. But he's saying, no, 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 like the Gothic, he doesn't call it the Gothic style, of course, but it elevates you conceptually. So that was the argument, and that's the intention behind it and the intention behind Gothic. So adhocism is before, is at the beginning. And of course, in you know, the Chinese artists of the first century said you've got to look in shadows and knots and dust clouds and so on to see things. And Leonardo did, and Arcimboldo in the 16th century did a series of seasons. You can guess which season that is if you look at it and what it's put together. And his amazing talent was combining combinatorial things as if for the first time. But it can be very practical, and this is something Nathan and I have talked about in this book, on improvisation. And the Royal Navy in the 17th century and before went around and looked at trees, mass-produced nature, and went around marking trees up to get curved surfaces and cut them and put them together without having to curve wood. Wonderful idea. Ad hoc. And of course, on a humorous and everyday level, this wonderful idea which Marx and others, the machine and the garden, put together. Here is the machine and the garden marrying each other. And there's some wonderful detail if you look in there for the birds too. So, you know, adhocism is both a style of eureka, a style before the stylists come in, before branding, before smoothing out the joints, before minimalism. It's all of that, and that's why we have to think of it that way as a kind of conscious invention too, and stumbled on invention. And if there's a chapter in the book on ad hoc revolution, discussion of Jefferson and the revolutions, the classic revolutions of the people, by the people, for the people. At their beginning, in the first stage, first two stages, has a common lost secret of revolution, as Hannah Arendt calls it, when in Germany the Rate, in America the townships, in France the councils, in every single revolution worthy of the name, including the one in Tahrir Square, the first two stages, they find the material, they organize spontaneously, made up of ad hoc groups, come together, create a space, the public realm. It's interesting, they reinvent circles, they reinvent, you know, signs, they reinvent clothing, they reinvent words, they reinvent everything, as if no one had done it before. And it's, of course, they haven't got a theory of this, they just do it. And of course, they redid it after, in February 2011, again and again and again and again and again. In this chapter, we discuss, you know, how, and very predictably say here, has been taken over, the revolution has been taken over. But that's why Hannah Arendt calls it the lost secret of revolution, because it's something not theorized. Jefferson himself said we have to save the townships, we have to go back. And believe it or not, Thomas Jefferson, the fourth president of the United States, said, I want to guarantee the right of revolution for every American. Anyway, a right of going back and forth on a rough floor, Nathan Silver chair, this wonderful chair, which shows you the how, the why, the what of how it's put together. It keeps a memory. This is architecture, furniture, design, which doesn't suppress the past. So it has a very funny and amusing relationship to all of that, where it comes from, why it's there, what it's working for. It has overtones, in this case, of, you know, ram's head and so forth. Seeing as is one of the ideas of creation. You see one thing as another thing, and take the corkscrew, the common ordinary corkscrew, and you can see it as someone erect, you can see it directing traffic, as a holdup, or as a rocket. And many more things. So, famously discussed by Ardis and Gombrich is seen as how all seen, indeed philosophers think all thinking, this is really an incredible hypothesis, is analogical. There's a new book out on this subject. That all thinking is its basis, comparison of one thing to another. So it's seeing one thing as another, seen as. And in our book, we start off with some images like this. And this is the 60s, and Nathan and I we're old living fossils of the 60s, and here's the kind of spirit we had in the 60s. You can see the face of these women. It's, of course, a feminist demonstration in London, in public realm. And, of course, the cross that the women are bearing here is humorous, and a dummy, you know, what have women been reduced to is a dummy, with the arms, with ready-made fingers. Look, if you look at mannequin shops, you can see that women's shops and mannequins selling gloves or anything are much too long. The fingers are about twice the length they should be, so women's fingers are stretched. And all of their signs of repression. But it's the spirit you can read in the faces, which tells you everything. Now, of course, in the art world, since Duchamp, and the ready-made and the ready-made aided, and his bringing to the conscious art market in 1913 because he reproduced this bicycle seat, as it were. Bicycle theft, and a whole series of other ready-mades. He's really going back to the 19th century. He's trying to liberate art, of course, from the optical, as he said, and put it on a new plane of choosing. So you could choose art, and ever since then, the art world has gone a bit crazy, as if this were the last and only word of what's meaningful in a creative art. So we live, 100 years now. This is, like Sacre de Printemps. This is the 100th year anniversary. Well, what a monument to something. But he was going back to Lautréamont in the 19th century, who famous French writer wrote, beauty is the fortuitous encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissecting table. Think of that. 3 things. The sewing machine, the umbrella, and the dissecting table. 3 things juxtaposed here too. And of course, it's beauty for Lautréamont and for the surrealists. And it's striking. And it's sexual, of course. The umbrella, the thin, long, pointed, the violated sewing machine, round, the Singer sewing machine, like a round, voluptuous thing. And dissecting table, this is kind of horrific. It's an act of destruction and eating and killing. But the surrealist took that sense of beauty, and I want to suggest that, of course, it has a tinge of ugliness in it, always, and of enigma, and of uncanny, and of alienation, and of horror. In the 19th century, that it was said that Victorian prudish society covered up piano legs because they were too erotic. They'd put a little stocking on the piano leg. Well, the surrealists took the leg and took it off the person and put it on the seat. So wonderful, and it walks off. The seat walks away. Seligman, 1938. So, Lautréamont. And one of the great films, if you haven't seen it, is The Scarecrow, 1920s, I guess, early 20s. But Buster Keaton on your left, and his wonderful fat foil on your right, sit in a house in which all the rooms are one room, and for architects it's very exciting. Everything turns into something else. So the sofa you don't see in the bed, turn one way and you open it and it becomes a bath. And then when you fill it up with water, you empty the bath into the outside. That recycles the water and feeds the birds and waters the garden. And salt and pepper come down from the ceiling. You pull one thing and glasses come down. And Buster Keaton and his foil are always swinging things in this house. The whole house is convertible into other things. So a great recycling humor. On the serious level, there is an argument which I was putting forward in this book in 1969 to 72 when we wrote it, 71, which was a critique of neo-Darwinism, the neo-Darwinist paradigm, which I've always been critical of. And in it, the argument is that mutation and natural selection are only a very small part. Evolution is much more complicated than that, and it proceeds by homologous structures in this case, and a whole lot of other things called internal factors in selection. Lancelot White wrote this book. It's never been accepted by biologists, but it's an absolutely epical book. And Kessler picks this up. Well, the homologous basic plan of that nature took out the patent on of the archetypal arm can be used for a bird to fly, for a horse to run, for a reptile moves this way, by the way, and for a human to grasp, and so on. So it's a basic form, and Darcy Thompson's into this, and architects are, that can be transformed. And so nature evolves, and this is the argument, by using these things. And it's been always a speculation of the human, whether different species were put around, maybe we don't know how or why, but they evolved different organs, and they leap across space and land on each other. And so there's a great tradition of the Homo monstrosus, which you can look at. This is 1665, elephant head on a human body, grotesque. And in the 60s, 1967 and 8, when you couldn't get really heaters in a room, and all the heaters you could buy were, I found repulsive in a way. So I combined it with a ready-made mannequin, as the surrealists did, and I thought my great breakthrough here was to wrap her in a nude coil, because you know wire worry. Have you ever heard of wire worry for architects? How do you get rid of the wire? You wrap it up in prison, and she's holding a book by Henry James called The Madonna of the Future, so that's her name. And I had a ticket from bus conductors, so you could print out the meaning. Anyway, there she is, no longer with us. Another idea we had around '69 was when I first thought critiquing the CIA, the FBI, Pentagon above all. The Pentagon, where it's so big, the center of life, that the parking, surrounded by 4 layers of parking lot, and a really horrible piece of late modern classicism. Ugly, horrible, repetitive, monstrous. Besides, what is the CIA and the FBI doing most of the time? They're handling misinformation and doing the wrong things. In the 60s, you can read about it from Chomsky and others. Anyway, so I did this collage of what would happen if all the world's products were typed in on your left by a typist and programmed all the products of the world, and you could sit, and this is the technology of 1969, before the web, before the World Wide Web, before all of that, Berners-Lee and all that. Person sitting with a telephonoscope and all the stuff, and you just sit there and write with a pen, and you can shop, because the CIA and the FBI are converted to information exchange. What happened was actually, it was CERN and the Defense Department which introduced the web, curiously, later. So if you could shop as an artist and as an architect, as a designer, as Tony Cragg shows in this beautiful construction called cumulus, like a cloud, which has been sandblasted. He bought a whole lot of things and ordered some. And he creates a floating composition, elegantly put together. So adhocism has many different versions and comes in styles, but at the beginning, before you think, before the stylists get in there, that eureka moment, you can see what, I guess it must be Isaac Newton's steam car looked like on the upper left. Can you believe? I don't know if it's, does anyone know if that is St. Newton? Anyway, could it be? Couldn't be in 17th century, could it? No, couldn't be, no. Okay, so some Newton named 19th century Newton. On the right, Cuno, the French and the Germans were there, and Verbiest, an Heliopile car, and then some vehicles that moved by electric battery. So natural evolution and mechanical evolution, the idea of adhocism is that, they start off in these series. You get a series, and they evolve and evolve and evolve. And every now and then, to make something new, the Messerschmitt with skis and a propeller and a Volkswagen engine, but boy, isn't it ugly. Okay, let's not run away from this one. And I was hoping Mark Cousins would be here, because he also has an interest in the ugly and how it relates to everything. Oh, here's Patrick. Hello, Patrick. You're just in time. You're just in time production with Patrick. Yeah, that's great. Okay. I didn't rehearse this, by the way, so it's very good to have you, Patrick. So ugliness, and adhocism and function and having to do it, need is the mother of necessity, is the mother of invention, there have been 4, 5, or 6 rovers, Mars rovers. This is the recent one. And in a way, they're all ad hoc, and in a way, they're all add-ons. And just to show you this one, in this collage put together in a way, What is common to the rovers is they have these funny wheels that children love that go up and over rocks because they have to. They all have machines for looking and photographing. Okay, cameras, you can add a camera ad hoc. But this one, the one that's up there called Curiosity, has a laser, that was new, zapping rocks, which they think now they have discovered water, and preconditions for life, and of course that's what, and then they have all sorts of high-tech drills and things added. And the great thing is ad hoc, you don't even see, which is laboratory on the inside, which can do chemical tests in seconds of all of the system information. So it's a put-together exquisite corpse of ugliness. And this is a thing I would like to debate in a way, because I feel that, and I think many people feel today, after 100 years of talking about it, where beauty was on the index for modernists, couldn't say, prettiness was an obscenity, you couldn't talk about beauty. Today, beauty, you can talk about it more, you can debate it. But ugliness, and this I throw out at you, the founder of the AA, Robert Carr, 23 years old, was one of the first people in Britain to write on the ugly. You know, that's interesting. Student here founded this. Okay. And the ugly, the beautiful ugly was debated in the 1860s and 1870s, and the glory of ugliness was probably spoken here by John Summerson. Beautiful essay on the glory of ugliness of Butterfield, William Butterfield. Now, what is it about the ugly which we find so interesting and beautiful and fascinating? It's aesthetic, of course, partly. So beauty and ugliness are both aesthetic. It's all the stuff in between, which is boring, which is not aesthetic in a way. It's just normal. If you think aesthetic, you can say you love something because it's painfully ugly. And Umberto Eco, in his book, he wrote the first book on beauty, and such a big seller, his publisher said, you have to write on ugliness now. So he did. And he found an amazing thing was, as you would guess, there would be an incredible asymmetry between beauty and ugliness, because the writing on beauty outnumbers the writing on ugliness about 1,000 or 2,000 to 1. There's only one big book on ugliness in the 19th century. No one thinks about it. And yet, it has its laws, and it has its etiology, it has its shape, it has its qualities. You can have ugliness with quality, and I think adhocism has to wrestle with this. Anyway, on to another idea, which is, in the book we talk about the pluriverse, a phrase I coined in 71, 72. And you can read Franz Boas, it would seem that mythological worlds have been built up only to be shattered again, and then new worlds were built from their fragments. Then you see Kepler's famous model of the universe in the 17th century and 18th century. And what he did is he took the Platonic solids and he inscribed the cosmic heavenly bodies, the planets, inside it. And then he worked out, gosh, the ratios are perfect. So therefore, it had to be, only a mathematician, geometer could believe that all the planets had to be in these ratios. And he really believed it. He was a passionate believer, and he discovered a whole lot from that mistaken idea. Anyway, the pluriverse, we live in a pluriverse. It's now called the multiverse. And, our major scientists and cosmologists more of them now have gone to, in the year 2000, this word multiverse has taken off, and from Stephen Hawking to Martin Rees and a whole, John Barrow and everybody else, more or less thinks that the only explanation that we can say while we're here, the anthropic principle, is that there is a multiverse, and we're in one of the best of all possible multiverses. And even at that time, this 68, and you look, this is a page from the book, it's called Cosmology Watching, July 68 to February 69. I was cutting every week a new cosmology out, quarks on quasars and everything. So that was happening then, and we're living in we're living in the golden age of cosmology. So my work is always cosmically driven, and the eye looking back at the universe and the story of the universe and the paradox. I won't go into that, but that's what I do, and that's what I'm doing a lot of now. There's the universe over 13.72 billion years old, which is what I thought it was when I built that in 2001, because that's what scientists thought it was. And then we started to understand more of the multiverse, and you see good universes in the middle like ours, and then collapsed ones to the left where gravity is too strong, and runaway ones to the right. And we live in the just right, balance to the 50th power. It's incredible balance. It's miraculous. It's just staggering. And this is normal science. What does it mean? What are its implications? So this was a photograph I doctored, knowing, I'm just an amateur. I'm not a professional. But I talked to them, and I discussed with them endlessly. And like Danny Liebskin, I drew over a whole lot of noughts and crosses and voids and circles all over the universe. This is the first picture of the universe to occur. The Kobe satellite came out 2002, 2003. So I put all of these things. This is, by the way, the Milky Way seen, which blocks out the rest of the universe. But this is what it looks like. This is what the universe seeds look like 300,000 years after the beginning. And there's the eye, which of course doesn't exist in the universe, but I said we're looking at this. So metaphorically, this is the big eye, and that's our little eye. And I drew circles, and look at that. I drew that circle there because that's black and blue, and that's of course a void. I didn't know why. And I drew all these noughts and crosses, you see, all over. Well, one of the exciting things about doing this, working with scientists, is that that's then, and so I made this concrete universe 13.72 billion years old, and this is what it looked like last April. And this is extraordinary. This is 1,000 times more accurate than the previous one, and we now know the universe is 13.82 billion years old. And here's some really funny, interesting things if you're interested in cosmology and the spiritual relation to the universe and all of that. We live, according to this photograph, in an asymmetrical universe. No one wants that. No one asked for it. And the scientists are going crazy. They can't figure it out. Why? And why is all this energy and seeds, and there shouldn't be structure at this scale. And more than that, there's this hole. Remember, I found the hole there and a little one there. This hole is so vast and deep and voided that one of the theories, I'm not kidding you, is that it comes from the hitting of another universe. It's one of those multiverses which bounced off ours, creating our, runaway. Anyway, what my excitement is that you create with the universe co-creation, and you're working with scientists, and you're working at that thing. Now we come to the hard bit for Patrick. He's arrived. And Beauty and Anish Kapoor. Anish Kapoor and Norman Foster had an argument 15 years ago, or 10, 12, I don't know, in which Norman said you cannot build a seamless building, although we're all trying. And the word seamless became the most repeated aesthetic term of praise from Brett Steele's design research unit all the way through Zaha to Norman to every single digital architect is always trying to do seamlessness. Okay, I'm not kidding. If you do a search on of words, of key words, you'll find seamless is always mentioned. Anyway, so Norman said you can't do it though. But we're trying, but we can't do it because finally the steel has to be joined to one piece. Anyway, Anish created the bean, became the most famous building, arch, entry. You can't get, you can crawl underneath, really. In Chicago, with all those modernist buildings in the background, seamless, almost seamless buildings. And he cost $12 million. And he said, oh no, you can build a seamless building. And the Norman said, no, you can't. They said, yes, you can. And so they spent another $10 million getting rid of the seams. And this building has no seams. If you want to spend double the money on the building, you can get rid of the seam. You can polish them all out if you make stainless steel. So that's the aesthetic of seamlessness, if you want to spend the money. But that's not adhocism, obviously. In this building, Ron Arad spent many times designing and building. This is an ad hoc chair made out of recognizable elements, 1982. And I got him to jump in his own chair, which is seamless, almost, which is a recent digital chair. So it shows, even Ron Arad, who was full of seams, who used to be, has now become seamless. It's true. Okay. So the time city and the ad hoc is not the seamless. Although, funny, curiously, this 9,000-year-old city of Matera in southern Italy looks, because it's built all out of stone, endlessly dug in, grottos and caves, dwellers, going right back 9,000 years, 7,000 BC, has been continuously rebuilt in concrete and so forth. And Umberto Eco has a very funny story about this. When modern planners came into Matera and they wanted to make the farmers happy, they designed a modern housing estate, and white and seamless, and they put in all of this new bathroom equipment, urinals, as Marcel Duchamp called them, urinals, and they were flushing urinals, which maybe women don't know about this, but in a men's loo, you flush like that, and you have a bowl. Anyway, the farmers, they were southern Italian farmers who didn't see any use for these urinals, and so they relieved themselves in the normal way outside, and they used them for cleaning the grapes. So they would take the grapes off the field and put them in the urinals and flush the loo. Of course, ad hoc, saving money. So an ad hoc time city recognizes pluralism, recognizes time, memory, change. In this, Gandhi worked for Soane, and he drew the history of architecture as a layered building like this. Gaudi was a great ad hocist who made, out of sewing machine parts, these windows and a whole lot of other things, rubble, masonry, stained glass, broke up tiles for seats, had people take off their clothes and sit to carve their bottom in the concrete, cover it with tiles. Very sensuous seat to sit on, ceramic. Constructivists, of course, early constructivists, and this is Vesnine brothers, who were classicists, who became modernists. 1923, the Pravda building, you see the word Pravda, with searchlight and a lot of ad hoc fixtures on a frame. Bruskov, the greatest ad hocist in America, worked for the Navy Seabees and built a lot of buildings out of this one for the oil workers in Oklahoma. He used the technology of oil drilling. There are masts, hold down the mast at the center with these tension members, hold the curved hyperbolic paraboloid roof that spills down, which is the walkway through the spiral of space, using rubble masonry on the outside. And to light it, he uses glass cullet, which is throwaway glass, which emerges from a natural process, and tells the time on the inside of the building. You can see what time it is by the color it goes. And he used it, this is why it's obsessive. And an ad hocist like Sujet or Goff he uses wonderful, I've always thought we should do this at Maggie Centers, use, carpets on the ceiling to lower the reverberation time. He put carpets all over his buildings to calm it down, to lower the noise. And this is the supreme ad hocist thing. He uses fishnet, of course. That's not all that unique. But he uses a bomber blister off a B-52 bomber as his lighting fixture. The victories of ad hocism. Hanselline, in the postmodern show of 1980, transforms the existing columns in all sorts of ways, use neon and so on, to tell the story of the column in architecture. Jim Sterling often had an ad hoc symbol at the high points of his building, which in this case, the Cambridge History Faculty Building, is an extract unit tripled, hung and suspended like a bug in a library in Cambridge. And in his postmodern work, makes an incredible set of juxtapositions, like l'autrement between die style and a whole series of local, vernacular, classical, hyperbolic paraboloids. You all know it. Frank Gehry, like Goff, was or is in part still an adhocist. This is his house. They say it's the house that built Frank. Literally, I mean, that's one of the titles of Beatrice Colomina's piece on Frank Gehry. Before this building, Frank was not, the most famous architect in the world, but after it, and it's thrown together well, you probably know it well enough, so I don't have to tell you about it, but it uses chain link in a wonderfully creative way. It flies around the building. And of course, all the people who live in the neighborhood hate the building because it uses chain link in a way which isn't functional. And he said, what's wrong with my chain link? They would try to sabotage him. Anyway, he corrugated furniture. I mean, it's so sensuous. This building, which is short-lived for an ad agency, this was the brainstorming room, and it's made out of corrugated cut paper, as his furniture, Easy Pieces was, and it lowers the sound, so it's like an anechoic chamber. You go in here, you can hear their heartbeat. It's so warm, so friendly. Shigeru Ban uses for traveling theater. We're going up through architectural history to just show a selected few. So architects come in and out of adhocism. He uses containers, obviously, to make a traveling theater, uses sonotubes, concrete, both, and other kind of tubes that are ready-made, and stacks the containers on a theater in such a way that you can use them on the inside for one thing and the outside to create this wonderful counterpoint, ABA rhythms, and classical building, by the way, if you just think of it, it's a temple, and a very cheap one. So today, in an era of, one doesn't have to say too much about this, but in our period, using things that are off the peg, ready-mades, ad hoc, is a way to go. And it brings me to my conclusion to look at what I now feel is the customary manner of adhocism. When I wrote the book, when Nathan and I wrote it, we thought this is a major movement and a major attitude. My feeling today is slightly different. It is that adhocism is more like a partial philosophy. It really is something that you do Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, maybe, a bit, like Sterling. You don't do the whole building. And maybe the Pompidou Center is a good example of this, because the Pompidou Center, which I think is directly in the ad hoc bloodline, takes some of the systems off the peg. But most of the case of the Pompidou Center, I believe, and Nathan can tell us, is specialized versions of off-the-peg elements. So, there are all sorts of things about this building which could be discussed. And I think that Gehry, when he does ad hoc things, it's like his F-16 for the Aerospace Museum. It's a ad hoc attachment, just as that solar collector is. He's really, as the constructivists were, they are attaching things. So they're not full ad hocists in the Bruce Goff sense. They're not, or in the sense which is rather challenging, like Sujet was. And they tend to be even minimalist. They can be minimalist, like this building by Chipperfield for the Neues Museum in Berlin, a great, great building, which has these incisions of Chipperfield in reinforced concrete, these grids of stone and concrete inside rooms that have been bombed and destroyed. And what he's done, as you probably all know, he's painted some with a whitewash. He's shown what he's changed and renewed. He's shown what's old. He's used 4 or 5 different techniques to make this palimpsest, this layering. And this is the Egyptian room. And it's a bit maybe over the top to say, but in a way, the building is better now than it was when it was first new in the 1860s, when then it was a little bit uptight, classicism. Today, it looks, it has such evocative qualities of space and meaning, like an archaeological site. which it partly is, of course, below, and really about Germany. So you see the Egyptian sarcophagus below you, and you enter in. It's a fantastic collage, palimpsest, time city. The time city, of course, is, I think, now accepted, and nothing more so than in New York. The elevated walkway, which is typically ad hoc in the sense it uses old buildings, of course, the old trains of 1920, the tracks that were rusting. It renews them with both a mixture of weeds and wonderful planting that is very consciously, uses concrete systems. It's a hybrid, not pure adhocism, but add-on adhocism. So I end with showing an example, which isn't just ugly, but it's beautiful as well, and that's the work of Herzog and de Meuron, because on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, they are very ad hoc, not always. Often they're minimalist and seamless. But here's a case, where stacked, they have 4 different systems, including the growth of a new green wall, Patrick Blanc, and a shadow line underneath, which keeps you cool in Madrid in this heavy temperature, and they're cast iron. It's not Corten, it's cast iron at the top with its mosaic ornament. We'll see that. And it's a time city. It takes you through as you walk up through the building. It addresses each of the squares in a different way. I mean, that's what's so interesting. It's a contextual building in a Framptonian sense. It speaks to the urban whole. It repairs, it uses this 19th century building, the brick building below, which is an electric station. And I've analyzed it here as a piece of music because you can read the melody lines horizontally and the harmony lines and disharmonies vertically. And it strikes me that, this shows you that adhocism can be a high art in a Lutyens-esque sense, or in the sense that architects always love, and they should, so they should. And here, these rhythmical qualities, I think, are almost like Stravinsky. This is, this real passion and destruction. There's a Sacre de Printemps in this building. It's a really violent building, and it's horrible in a way. But as you go under it, as you go in those ABA rhythms and that symphony, you come in the cool, and it connects up the 4 squares, and you can see, as you walk up, you're in a completely different style of high-tech and fractals, of concrete. And just in the middle lower right, you see they're funny little capitals made out of, things that, watering cans. Watering can capitals? What's Herzog up to, And this symphony of, as you come up the stairs, of this beautiful metal in a different world than what you've seen on the outside, with a high-tech collage, as you see those watering cans in this symphony for artists. This is where the artists meet there. And you go to the top, of course, it's a restaurant, and you break out through the view, and you see the fractal of the city, and you see the fractal of nature. So it even uses ornament, Arab ornament, in a mass-produced way to tell you a different story. I end finally with a parable, and there are many endings, I would say, to take you back to the beginning of creation and the idea of, which is really strange and uncanny, again, which Umberto Eco talks about in the age of modernism, the Enlightenment of Immanuel Kant, and the whole French philosophical school and biology. In French biology, they said, nature, the law of balance, everything has to be balanced. And all the species are well balanced. And everything's a whole, holism. And everything fits together. And it's quite beautiful. Everything's beautiful. For architects, this has always been one of the measures of beauty is nature. I'm going right back to the Vitruvius and all through Alberti. Everybody believes it's true. Nature is beautiful, which is true. However, in this Enlightenment period, Immanuel Kant, who talked about the species and the law of balance, were really stymied when the French biologists brought back this animal. It was a total shock to the nervous system. I mean, it was ugly without a question. So the French sent it naturally to the British to dissect, because the French couldn't believe it and leave it to the English. So they sent it to, this is a true story, sent it to a biologist in London, the equivalent of Natural History Museum, and they said, now, can you please take it to pieces and tell us, because we can't find them, where it's been stitched together. Okay, show us the, you know, the marks and the lines. And so the English biologist looked at the taxidermist, literally the best, tried to find, and they couldn't find any stitch marks. But they were convinced it was a fraud and a hoax. Okay? For the next 50 years, this ugly animal was considered a hoax and couldn't be, and it was suppressed in the history of biology. It didn't fit. I'm not making this up. By 1850, you know, another duck-billed platypus was found in Australia, the down under, you know, and another. So by 1860, they thought, okay, they're real, but we don't want to know about them. By 1920, you know, biologists were scratching their head and saying, well, what's a species anyway? Well, I'm not kidding about this either. They said a species, you know the definition of a species? This was true up until 1950, 1960. A species is what the best biologists say is a species. How about that as a tautology? Anyway, I won't go into that, but it was by 1970, children in Australia started to love it. And it became a famous television show. By 1995, it was, you know, when the Olympics was being planned, it was put on a, whatever it is, 10 cents or whatever in Australia, stamp. And by the year 2000, or the Olympics, whenever that was in Sydney, it became the mascot of Australia. So from fraud to the mascot of Australia, one of the three mascots of the Olympics, you know, is this history of adhocism, repression, ugliness. And it's made, you know, more than this, it's more than a reptile, because it walks in the wrong way. It doesn't walk like other animals walk. So mammals, it doesn't walk like a mammal. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it should be a duck. It's called the duck-billed platypus, but it doesn't quack. And it lays eggs. So it should be a bird, but it's not a bird, doesn't fly. And it is a mammal. I mean, okay, so it's an impossible categorical mistake. And it even, you know, it navigates, when it hunts, it closes its eyes, get this, it closes its eyes and moves by electrolocution. It locates its prey by electricity, you know, zeroes in. Okay, so it's the ultimate ad hoc, uncanny, wonderful mascot. And I think the great thing of adhocism, it's great one day a week maybe, as this shows, the duck-billed platypus, but not for every minute of every day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charles. Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Can we do a few questions? And I'll give people a minute to settle, since I've been invoked as one of the poster children of the continuous surface or seamless project. Feel obliged to offer, let's say first a light and maybe personal question, followed by maybe a slightly more serious one. The light one would be, can one imagine an art historian making an argument that connects the appearance of a funny-looking chair to a theory of cosmology, to a theory of the universe, to the origins of evolution that could be less seamless than this presentation? In other words, what is the difference between an improvised argument, or art historical project even, and the artifacts, styles, movements that are being analyzed? Because in effect, what we've just seen is a dazzling demonstration of a lecture that's absolutely as improvised for, again, a very seriously trained PhD historian who has written the history of late modernism, about as improvised an art historical argument as one could hope to see, right?
You're saying it's seamless.
Pretty seamless, no? In fact, in ways that most of us that were just trying to find a way to polish a bit of metal could, at a certain level, as being seen as much more modest than the ambition of arguing across all art or cultural projects. And I'm just wondering if you might comment on the nature of the argument itself and how you've come to develop it.
Well, it's as I've said, it came out of the 60s, and it came out of there's a lot of other forces behind it, but I think basically the counterculture, archogram, the school, being fed up with certain kinds of things like the CIA and the FBI, and modernism, which was dumb and didn't articulate the environment. There were a lot of negative aspects to it, and which are rooted in its time. And as I said, it is kind of humorless on one level, which I enjoy. I mean, we had a kind of belief that this was really important. What was the other question?
Well, no, I mean, in a way it touches on what I was thinking of as maybe the slightly more serious version of a very similar question, which would be in your over the 40-year project, let's say, between the appearance of this book, which would arguably be a more improvisational time, let's say, for a moment. And I was thinking of this as you were deriding my improvised introduction, that making it up a bit on the fly is, in fact, a certain way of performing or working that you could say is an American ingenuity. Let's think of jazz, which is often acknowledged as one of the few genuine cultural projects that America finds a way to stumble on, a purely improvised form of music. Abstract expressionism, which you could say your own genealogy springs right out of in the 1960s, which is again a sort of painting operation that's sort of made up on the fly, a la Pollock, etc. And I'm just wondering now, looking back on where we are, from where we are today to that moment, it is indeed a time when you could say architecture is far less improvisational than it might have been in the 1970s. No?
Yeah, I mean, in the 60s we didn't have any work, and in the early 70s, so it's a bit like today in that sense. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, and I think adhocism comes back into focus, and it does today. I think there's a real reason for it. It has, as Nathan will say, there's a sensibility which is beyond its necessity, and which is a style, as I've been saying, the style of eureka. So there's all sorts of motives for it, I think, which are relevant today. But as I'm suggesting, it doesn't strike me it can't be a holistic approach, and it features pluralism. And this is where I think the metaphysics. I've always looked at architecture as a metaphysical practice, and therefore, the spiritual and the cosmic are something that architects, in a way, can't run away from and ought to be responsible for. So my own work is cosmically directed, but I'm not advocating that as a universal program. I don't, it'd be horrible if you had to face the universe every day. So that I'm saying that it's a partial approach, and it's suggestive in an age where architectural practices are too big, too mass-produced, too branded, too driven by convention, and what we were critiquing, which is a kind of conformity of taste. And in that, the seamless has become like a paradigm of what we should be aiming at. And I think, that can lead to its own kind of repressions. I'm not saying, and of course I don't think you do, and I don't think Zaha does, but I think there is a danger that it's the great unspoken unifier. And when you try to unify a culture through technology and style in such a seamless way, it becomes monolithic, and you have to critique it. It immediately invites the other.
I mean, just one last point, leading to a question on this front, which is that you also touch upon your long interest in the politics of architecture and space, with one or two images, I think, quite interesting way in this talk. But you also, of course, are acknowledging that I should think political discourses today seem to be far less improvised than they were 30, 40 years ago, as social movements were reacting to things and trusting that enough to let things unfold. Maybe most famously with an American president now who only ever stands in front of the world with a teleprompter between himself and that audience, which he's been heavily critiqued for, despite the belief system behind it. And I'm struck today in a school like this, the extent to which at the end of a year presentation you'll see students reading a script about their year's experience. What Edward Tufte calls the cognitive style of PowerPoint, that the world is becoming more scripted and choreographed. In events like this that are being recorded and now broadcast worldwide as you're speaking, there is a certain person or art historian afraid to improvise for fear of everything from scholarly to popular dislike, and you're making an appeal for the need.
It's always been different, come on.
Yeah, but you are making a compelling argument for the need still, and that's what I find interesting in the argument for performing the argument and seeing where that...
I mean, I agree that one of the things that Hannah Arendt writes about in On Revolution, great book, no one reads it, is that in these revolutions at the early stage, it's speech and action. It's, that the human rediscovers speech. Speech is action by words and projection and by personal commitment. And speech and action is always tragic in a sense because you can never predict what's going to happen, and that's why politicians hate real speech and real acting and real crowds. So it's funny how, Margaret Thatcher, for instance, said Britain was the mother of all democracies. And if you look at how democracy in Britain was shrunk in the 11th and 12th century to, a few people like barons behind closed doors in private committing acts, you can see in why she critiques, the whole notion that politics has to be shrunk to a controllable Senate, a controllable space off the street. And we know that this isn't true, but we know it is of our time. We know that, and we're all trying to reinvent a politics of the digital, the politics of different kinds of participation. But ultimately, in the 60s was very much about this. However bad the 60s was and how crazy it was the personal is political, and the political is speech and action, as she's saying, in the public realm. Because the public realm comes into being only insofar as people can speak and act. That's why it's shrunk to the House of Parliament, House of Commons, House of Lords. That's where you'll see real speech and action to a degree, although it's so choreographed with the left and the right, and ritualized killings, and 10.5 seconds for people to make a point of order. You're called on after 4 days to make this point of order in the House of Lords. That's not speech and action. That's not politics. That's completely choreographed power. And in the 60s, of course, we critiqued that. And you can't say it enough, what you've just said and what I'm just saying. That was a kind of lesson of the 60s. So yes, yes, yes. I don't know. We live in a time when I think the world really was amazed by Tahrir Square and by what was happening there. Whatever you think about that, and in the book, by the way, in Adhocism, I have a chapter showing this lost tradition emerging in Tahrir Square, unpredicted, unorchestrated, unchoreographed. And it's almost textbook in every way. And I think the whole world watched that on television and whatever frame they were using, digital. And they were full of hope. The world was full of hope. And we knew, but we had a great knowledge of what might happen. And it has happened, or it's happening now. It's the reduction of the public realm to power politics. And so it is most distressing. And, yes, to what you just said. We
Let's
must
open it up to the floor.
struggle against things anyway.
Questions
But
from
I'm
the
a
floor?
60s character.
This side, over here? Anyone? Yeah, Nathan.
to hear your thoughts about, at this moment, when you're telling us about seamless architecture being of the moment, and the discovery of the Higgs boson, and the way that the Earth seems to be rethought in its structuring,
The Higgs boson. right?
relative to your cosmic.
This is Julie Corman, who's also almost of the 60s, but you're really 70.
1966.
Okay. UCLA? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the Higgs boson. Well, I know Higgs and his friend, and the boson is really exciting, and it's opened up cosmology. And the people in CERN are really both elated and very unhappy, because it appears that it closes it's the 17th part of the puzzle that fits beautifully. And it seems that we've discovered the standard model, as it's called, with all 17 parts, predicted and then discovered. It's an incredible thing. Spent $20 billion on it. But then it's not telling us anything that we want to know. It's a kind of great so what comes out of it. And but on the other hand, scientists, you can only make scientists unhappy for a week or so, and then we think it's really showing something else, and so they're back on their happy again. But it's suggesting that there's really another physics waiting in the wings, and CERN thinks that they're booting up next year. They'll find out what this other physics is. They're hoping they're gonna find dark matter is the big thing, which Rolf Hoyer says is on the agenda. He's the head of CERN. And then, black holes, they may create a small black hole, don't worry, and other things. So, and they think that they'll find this new physics, which, is uncanny. We have hints of what this is, but like the multiverse is an example, and dark energy is another one. So we have hints. But we may, this is what's discouraging, we may never, ever get beyond a certain level of understanding here. Martin Rees has famously said and written that our minds might just not be good enough, or us as a species, to figure out what's beyond us. Why? We always think that we can figure anything out, and why would you be a scientist if you didn't think so? Well, so there's a kind of pessimism, I think, in also in the optimism of discovering, how the standard model fits together. We know there's something basically wrong with the standard model, although it fits so beautifully. We know it's wrong because it can't resolve gravity and the quantum. That is the tiniest things in the universe, the quanta, and the biggest things in the universe. It doesn't fit together. All the equations that fit it together produce infinities, and infinity is a duck-billed platypus. That's what infinity is to a scientist. It really is crazy. They tear out their hair when they see it. So, we're on the edge of something, and it's always, on that creative edge, it's very upsetting and very exciting at the same time. Don't have an answer, as you can tell. Yeah.
Charles, that was a terrific general presentation. The only things that I would say, which you didn't mention, but which I think are important to know, that when we first wrote about this in 1971, 72, we went about it with a real air of trying to attack a complacent kind of modernism, and not just in architecture, but in an assumption, a puristic assumption in lots of creative fields, and a lack of recognition about where creativity came from. And now, 40 years later, there may be a tendency for people to see the story in the opposite way. It's something we know all about, and to a certain extent, of course, that's perfectly true. And what's more, people have always known all about adhocism and what its energies But it was the creative energies that we were particularly interested in, and I think that's something that we should be able to say a little bit more about. And the subtitle of our book in 1972 was The Case for Improvisation, which is a pretty good subtitle. But since then, I've also thought that another aspect of it, which is almost equally important, is the remembrance of things past. Because there really is an element, there's a vital element of nostalgia. Nostalgia is a word that we don't like to look at directly because it's corny and it's messy and it gets us into trouble and it's kitschy and so on. But there clearly is something very, very noble about nostalgia in certain respects. And that's one of the things that adhocism has an approach to. So that's one thing I was going to say. The other thing is that there are aspects of adhocism some of which are very, very interesting and revealing, which we go into, of course, in the book, but you didn't cover in the kind of survey naturally. The sans papier is very interesting because architects, and I think the general public, see it in two different ways. To architects, we see it as a building that's primarily a megastructure. It's a very big, powerful, well-engineered, brilliant, long span. It's a megastructure. But to the general public, I think they saw it and still see it as a polemic of something else, which is adhocism, because they see the bits and pieces, they see the intestines falling out, and so on. When I did a book, which is a biography of the Sans Pompidou, I talked to two people who were very interesting on the subject. One was the chairman of the jury that gave the award to Piano and Rogers, and that was Philip Johnson. And I said, the word is that you were the member of the jury who really went all out for this and said, we have to choose this building. This is the one, this is the design that we must give the prize to. I said, why was that? And he said, I thought it was the only building that would be built. It was the only building that could get built because the only building that had the flexibility to change in the ways that were going to happen to it in all the years of the 7 years. That was one. The other was Renzo Piano. When I was working on the book, I said, what's the idea here? And he said, the idea is that we have a primary structure that's going to last for 500 years, and we have a secondary structure that's going to last for 100 years. And then we have bits and pieces, then we have the services and so on, and they're only going to last for 35 or 25 years. And it's replaceable in all its aspects except for the primary structure. And that's a very good elucidation of what you were saying about Monday, Wednesday, and Friday being when you practice adhocism. That's a building that practices adhocism Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and it's also got the Tuesday and Thursday as well.
Good. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think Patrick.
No, I just wanted to point out that I believe that adhocism, as you presented, is more of a methodological concept. Methodological concept, rather than, for me, an aesthetic concept. And I think what you just mentioned about creativity and how where creativity resides, and that's a kind of demystification of creativity, largely in the random, and then in a kind of mutation, recombination, which is undirected and random, which then exposed to problems, selection, finally reproduction. So I believe in that aspect, and I think it is something which has become as powerful in revolutionary and challenging times. I agree with that, but I don't think it has an interim and process value. For me, it hasn't a final product value because it is maybe the initial ad hoc clobbering together of something which you then which kind of disguises in a sense that a new unit of interaction is created, It presents a kind of jumble, no unity. It presents false signals about the parts and their function. So I think to the charm of that might be of interest, but I think it's ultimately to be replaced by another principle, which is then the kind of articulation, refinement, and making legible of the new universe interactions. And I mean, we have been interested in seamlessness as maybe that secondary process on top of a much larger buildup of complexity. And we like, we're talking about multi-system setups, multiple ontologies coming together, but then forging new syntheses. And we like a lot the Deleuzian concept of assemblage, which is in there and is contrasted to the organism as something which is very, very stable. These are new units of interaction and functional unities, maybe even temporally, but I think they are more than just a kind of pile of parts. And if it remains, and that pile of parts is maybe that engineering tinkering, that's when you look at backyards where there's no architect involved.
What about that?
I think where engineers...
Pile of parts.
Yeah, no. Well, that's just the perception problem of something unusual. But so that's where I would come in. I think it's fallacious to aestheticize that and make that a kind of aesthetic category, while it only could be...
You think it's fallacious?
Yeah, because I think it's valid as a process category and methodological. It wasn't a question, I was just making a statement. But the second... okay, maybe, yeah, I just want to offer that as a challenge.
Thank you, Patrick. I mean, that was near perfect. Yeah, I know. I understand. I think everybody in the room understands fully what you're saying. And you know, to a certain extent, I was saying it before you came into the room. That and things start in ad hoc. You know, the beginning. It's the eureka moment. That was my argument before the stylists get in. Before Norman Foster gets and erases the joints, or Anish Kapoor in my seamless parable. So I know what you're saying, and I know why you're saying it, and I know why it's the strongest force in our culture, not only in the architecture world, but why almost everything in fashion now is seamless. Anyway, I understand all that. I think we all know because we see it in fashion. I mean, Anyway, then of course, people like this kind of thing if there are too many seamless things, right? So they just love things that aren't seamless. So, I mean, but I'm arguing in the thing about ugly, I'm hoping we can accept the ugly as an aesthetic category. I think that's really key here. I mean, let's try to smooth over our differences, okay? I think, they used to say, Alberti and all the aesthetics that you admire, this was a unified whole. But its complexity in unity, and was always a mixture of variety and unity, unity and variety. Those phrases occurred again in the École des Beaux-Arts, they occur in your work. And, and that's why I showed the work of Herzog's, I ended with that. Because, in a way, it was wrestling with the question that Nathan was saying, memory and nostalgia and history. And it wasn't denying the past, it was trying to build on it in a new way. Now, that is a different kind of complexity than the kind that you and the unity and variety people are saying. And I think my argument is, okay, you've dominated the airways for the last 5,000 years, since the Egyptians argued for unity and variety and seamlessness, if you look, Egyptian aesthetics. Up until today, I know it's the reigning aesthetic, and I understand what you're defending, but what Umberto Eco and the platypus is showing us is there is another aesthetic, at least, the ugly aesthetic. And that has its own history and etiology. And if you, as I do, love Chinese rocks, I recommend for you, what you need is a good dose of Chinese rocks. Because they are beautifully ugly and ugly beautiful. And you can't, when you look at a Chinese rock, you know you're in a category problem like this. You look at it and you say it's painfully, some of it's lugubrious, some of it's repulsive, turns your stomach. but you enjoy it like a child, or you enjoy it like an adult. You enjoy being turned. And I know that you enjoy spicy food, or you enjoy things that go against your own taste. So even you like, from time to time, as the Marquis de Sade said, a shock to the nervous system, and all children love. So even a purist like you, and a seamless purist like you, has a holiday from your normal slavery to integration. And, you know, I bet you, if I looked at what you know, Mies van der Rohe, Maddie, who I know is in the front row, you know, Mies collected, was a friend of, who was that guy? The not Die Stahl, but the German who was on the run from the Nazis, who ended up in Britain, who made the Merzbau. Schwitters. Schwitters had Mies to dinner. He had Patrick to dinner, as it were. And he built this great monstrous thing through his own house. And, you know, it was a put together ad hoc, you know, mélange of all of his life and everything, including Mies. He took the hairs from Mies's head and he put them in his Merzbau. The Nazis destroyed it, by the way. So I'm arguing that we live in a different space today, Patrick, where, you know, we have to acknowledge what you're saying, but it shouldn't be the dominant. We do need Mondays and Fridays.
I like a lot the Monday, Friday. That rhythm, I think, is really important, and I agree with it. Is I'm not this kind of monist, monotonist. I mean, it's all for me about the difficult whole and temporary
Well, the
acceptance.
difficult whole was Venturi's phrase.
And absolutely that there's, and Tafuri talks about the aesthetic revolutions, but I think we need to look at it historically. It's not that adhocism is always in the same way a parallel potential and value next to a kind of integrated synthesis project. I think it goes in that rhythm, in that wave of revolution, adhocism, trial and error, which at that moment is better than what has went into crisis, namely a kind of false synthesis. And then you're moving through that historically, and then try to. This is the same in biology between exaptation and adaptation. You know, Jay Gould versus.
Well, yours is the Whig theory of history. But anyway, I take your point.
Yeah.
I think we'll wrap it up there, everyone. Thank you all so much. Just a reminder, please, Nathan is in the room this evening, as is Charles. Stack of books in the back there, please, while they're available. Why don't you get the guys to sign it? Thank you. Charles, thank you.